It's the Steve Padilla Sessions. I am Kevin Pang from America's Test Kitchen, joined this week and every week by Baxter Holmes, senior NBA national writer for ESPN, and of course, our mentor, our hero, Steve Padilla, LA Times column one editor, and writing coach extraordinaire. So, guys, gentlemen, it's really nice to see you. Now, normally a little peek behind our how we do things on this little rinky-dink show here. We usually do, as you know, a lot of preparation, which involves us going on an email chain and saying, what do you want to talk about this week? And someone will say, what about structure? And then that's it. We just talk about structure for 45 minutes. That's usually how it goes, right?
Right.
But this week I said, we are not going to have anything prepared. And it is because we have a very special guest joining our trio. And this week is going to be a quartet. So mystery guests, will you please sign in, please? I feel like this is What's My Line.
Feels like this is your life. This is great here. That's a cultural reference no one will understand anymore. Oh my God.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Erika Hayasaki, former LA Times reporter extraordinaire, and now journalism professor at UC Irvine's literary journalism program, and one of Steve's star students, I would like to say. Erika, how are you?
Good. How are you? Hi, Steve.
Hi. Oh my
I'm
God.
happy to be here. We've been trying to connect for so long, so I'm so excited to connect.
Yeah, and it took Kevin to bring us together. This is wild, you know. I'm trying to remember, did you all three overlapped at the LA Times together, right? I mean,
I think a little bit with Kevin, but I didn't know Baxter. Yeah.
I think I got there in 2009, which was around the time. I don't know exactly when you left.
I left in 2009. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's been that long. Wow.
Amazing. But anyway, Erika is here because Erika has worked on so many fantastic, memorable stories with Steve over the years. And I think you can just read Erika's stories and I can just see, that's a Steve Padilla touch right there. Erika, tell me just any memories of meeting Steve as a young cub reporter at the LA Times.
Yes, well, I have a whole bunch of notes on Steve, lessons that I've learned. And so I wanted to bring these to first. I wanted to say something about Steve, if that's okay.
Please.
Okay.
So I thought about this. I was thinking about Steve. I've thought about you a lot, and it's been hard for us to connect in recent months, but I just feel like Steve is one of these incredibly special people, these mentors that we're so lucky to have, Kevin and Baxter, and like so many of us. And I feel like since I met Steve, I was like 21 years old when we first met. He interviewed me at the LA Times for the MetPro program. And in the years since, I've become a mother, I've become a professor, and, I've thought a lot about mentoring and how important that is to the world. And I think about that a lot just in current, the time that we're in right now, where it feels everything feels chaotic. And so I always bring myself back to this one quote that I came across when I was working on The Death Class, which is a book that I wrote, which Steve actually read early versions of. And it was a quote from a psychologist. And his name is Irvine Journalism, and he wrote this book called Staring at the Sun. And he came up with this idea of the rippling effect, which refers to the fact that each of us creates, often without conscious thought or knowledge, concentric circles of influence that may affect others for years or even generations. That is, the effect that we have on other people is in turn passed on to others, much as the ripples in a pond go on until they're no longer visible, but continuing at a nano level. And so I think this goes for mentors, but I feel like this goes for Steve so much because, these lessons that you pass on, which I'll get into in a second, I've been able to pass on to students, and, students have been able to pass on to more readers, and then all of the people that you've been able to mentor. So it's like this rippling effect happening throughout the universe with your lessons. So I just wanted to put that out there. And one of the lessons that I remember out of many is the importance of sitting down with an editor like you who can talk about a story before you've necessarily even gone and done all the reporting. And that's this one thing that Steve does. So, you know, we will have, when we weren't in COVID, we would like have coffee and talk about ideas before they had even really, you know, been reported out or fully fleshed out. And one story that I remember working on with you, Steve, which you probably don't even remember, but it was so long
Let's see.
ago. It was this Mother's Day in prison story.
Oh,
So
I
it
totally
was
remember
like,
that.
you probably don't remember. It was a weekender, and it was like, you know, you work the weekend shift. What's the story for Mother's Day? And there was a program. It was like sending these teenage kids to prison to visit their mothers in prison. So you could do that as a weekender, right? And just like do the fact that this happened. But we sat down, had this long coffee at the LA Times, and we talked about like tracing that whole journey to the prison and back. And so I think what I did there is I remember going to the teenager's house the night before. She lived with her grandmother, and she was like picking out her clothes, and she picked out these huge bamboo earrings that she was gonna wear into the
I remember
prison.
the earrings.
Yeah, you remember the earrings? Okay. So
Oh, yeah. They play a
yeah.
role. They play a role. They actually play an important role in the story later.
Yeah, and so sorry about my lighting here. I'll close in a second. But yeah, so she's picking out those earrings, and her grandma's like, you know, you're not going to get those into the prison. Like, you're not going to be able to wear those earrings in the prison. And she's like, I am wearing these earrings in the prison. And so the next morning, I get up at like 6 o'clock. I go on this like 5-hour journey to the prison with her. Maybe it wasn't 5 hours; it felt really long. But rode the bus with her. She gets to the security guard. She gets to the front, and they're like, you can't wear those earrings into this prison. But they knew her, and so they're like, okay, fine, we'll let you in. And so they kind of they let it slide. She comes in, she sees her mother, but the interactions with her mother are very uncomfortable because she's sort of grown up and become this other person. And so when she's leaving the prison, this is sort of the ending of the piece, she's looking around all these kids, and they're crying and they're upset. And she just sort of is like, you know, kind of emotionless. And she just leaves, and the last scene is like she leaves. They check her earrings, actually, because that was something they knew that she checked in. So we followed these earrings and her journey, but the earrings became this symbol of her sort of coming of age. I'm going to fix my lighting here. I'm sorry for.
Well, actually, can I tell you what one of the things this relates to? Because I remember this vividly, our discussion. We talked about how she was going to interact with how the daughter, whatever, I'm sorry, I don't remember her name, but the daughter, how she was going to interact with mom.
Right.
And of course, in the movie version, she would, break down in tears, give her mom a big hug, say, Happy Mother's Day, I love you, I miss you every day, and so I remember, Erika, one of the things we talked about was, I think I told you, no matter what happens, it works. That if she was cool, it works. If she is emotional, it works. If she's distant, it works. No matter what was going to happen, it's going to work, because our whole thing is just to chronicle that day, right? And I think that, because I think you went into it thinking we might be looking for the Hallmark movie version of the reunion.
I don't.
And so I was trying to assure you it would work, whether it would. In fact, I think it was in some ways it was a richer story and more profound story that the girl didn't react the way the other children were with their moms on that day.
So let me ask you, this is so fascinating because, you talk about this lesson, Erika, of sitting down with your editor and really, like pre-gaming or just like doing your prep work, right? I'm going to try to get you to, think back to all those years when you did that story. And do you remember the realization that what was the light bulb coming over your head after talking to Steve about that particular story? What was the insight that you gleaned from that conversation before you even went on that reporting assignment?
I think it's about theme. I think that Steve is always thinking about theme and how do you capture theme in the reported details. And so how do you, and sometimes that takes discussion, right? And so that's something that I'm always thinking about too when I'm like in the field and just, always thinking about how do reported details evoke theme. And so like that lesson that clicked for me, that
Mhm.
I remember that lesson with the earrings clicking for me so well, because it was like, this was her statement. This was her moment to say, you know what, I'm not that kid anymore, and I'm not crying, and I'm, I'm wearing my earrings, and it sort of meant so much more than just this moment. But that was like it's like a lesson in this weekender story that I have certainly carried on to like
That's also
large
a
scale
kind of,
things. Yeah.
the interesting thing about those earrings, I remember them being big hoop thingies, right? They were
Mhm.
like big hoop,
Yeah.
you know,
Big old
okay,
bamboo, like,
okay.
yeah. Hmm.
And they remind me of that. I think it's Chekhov who said something about writing that
Done.
if you have like a, what's the quote? If you have a gun mounted on the wall,
Yeah.
in a story, it
Like in
should
the
go
first
off.
act, yeah, it better go off by the,
Better
yeah,
go.
it's called like just the
Right.
rule of Chekhov's gun, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So sometimes when we're deciding, oh, I want to add color to the story, why are you doing it? Is it just to create a
Yeah.
theme, or are you planting a seed with something that's gonna, grow or shift or change or become relevant later on? You know,
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
because interestingly, with those earrings, it could have worked if it was just the grandmother and the girl, just debating them. But then it got better when the guards, want to stop her, but then show this. It actually really felt for the guards because you thought they showed this amazing kindness to let
Yeah.
her get in with those things.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the other interesting thing about this, I think, in terms of reporting technique, is all you kids out there,
Mhm.
is I think we love it when we get to do essentially ride-alongs and follow and go along with people and enter their world. But notice Erika just didn't show up that day. She met the girl ahead of time, so she already developed that relationship. And then when you actually did the reporting, now you were on the bus for 4 or 5 hours. You're right. Um, but by then she already knew you. I mean, and I think that was pretty significant that you didn't just do the ride along. You did the what did you say? The
Pre-gaming.
the pre-gaming,
Yeah,
yeah, and
pre-interviewing or
then
whatever.
you
Yeah.
did the game. I think that's pretty key.
Yeah.
And that's so important with the discussions that we were able to have, because you can sit down and like, I got a weekend shift, right? What am I going to do? That's like not going to be the typical like quote, 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 right? And, 1 hour story. It did take more time, but it was like this clip that I certainly remembered and like still think about as so pivotal, because we were able to have that journey in there and like theme, character going on a journey, theme, details, all that stuff within like a 24-hour story, really.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it,
and then that's also the interesting thing is the issue of point of view. Do you try to tell it through the eyes of the mom? Do you tell it the eyes of the daughter? Eyes of the grandmother? Whose lens are you using for it?
Right.
You know.
Baxter, I want to bring you in here. Do you remember, I'm sure you've had many, many lunches at the LA Times cafeteria with Steve and probably outside at some coffee shop talking about stories pre-gaming, the story before the story. Any particular insights, any memories of those conversations, Bax?
Oh man. I've had so many of those with Steve. And it's funny, Erika, even as you were talking, I was thinking about this, and Kevin alluded to it. I think Kevin and I have talked about this too, like this light bulb moment where Steve he might in some ways like mention some detail that you're like kind of word vomiting up like your idea, or maybe you've done some pre-reporting or you've done some reporting and you're just kind of like throwing you can't really see the forest of the trees yet. And then Steve will say, I wonder about this. And then like all of a sudden the fog is lifted and you can see very clearly on a lot of these stories. There was this one story I did, Steve, you may remember this. I did a story about a blind marathon runner.
Oh yes.
And so, and they ran with someone, and each of them held one end of a shoelace. And that was kind of how they were tethered to each other. And we had an amazing photographer who was out, who got a silhouette photo of them, and you could see the shadow of the shoelace on the pavement as they were running.
Mhm.
But Steve, I had kind of explained, he was like, well, tell me about them. What kind of person are they? Like, how long have they been running? What's their running routine like? Do they run with someone? And I mentioned the shoelace, and Steve just like stopped me. He was like, he's like, we need to talk about that, like, because that's in a way the sense that they can feel and that they can see in a way, there's the connection with the person there. And he made me realize like the power of this inanimate object, and kind of, I mean, the way we were talking about the earrings earlier, but there's been many like that. And something I wanted to say to Steve's point earlier, and then the concept of like sitting down with an editor and maybe talking about a story. One of the things that's great about Steve is I've editors, we know of editors who they have a very like clear idea, I think, of what they think the story is, maybe before any of the reporting has been done.
Yeah.
Like, go get this, whatever, this weekender, it needs to read like this and fill 500 words. It's, I want this, and that. And Steve, I think, is very open to and makes us open to the concept of, let the reporting guide you in a way to the truest sense of whatever that story may be. And he'll certainly have these conversations with you, and you'll kind of talk things out, and then he'll help you narrow down, like, it might just be, as I mentioned, or as we've all mentioned, Steve kind of pointing us to, or helping us see better what the clearest kind of story is. But Steve's open to that.
Yeah.
And he makes
Baxter,
us open to that. Yeah.
Actually, one of my techniques for that, for any editors out there, is, not necessarily that I tell you, here's what your story is I just, listen to you guys talk or ask enough questions, and then you kind of figure it out. So Erika,
Yes.
Regarding your book, The Death Class.
Yeah,
And,
I have another example too. I actually have your notes. I pulled them.
Oh, really? Okay. and I remember the, I hope I'm not telling stories out of school, is the, there was hope by the publisher that the ending could be different somehow.
I think I have those notes somewhere too.
That it wasn't awful, but they wondered, could there be something else?
A sense of arrival. That's what you wrote.
Okay. And I remember we just had this long conversation, and I didn't actually have an idea for the ending, but I just kept asking questions. And then you did indeed come up with a different sense at the end, and changed it.
Yeah, and so another example I pulled. So I don't know if you remember this story I wrote about this girl who was like thrown off a cliff and had to like
Oh God.
go out of a cliff, and ended up like meeting this woman who saved her. It was years ago, but you wrote that you said you just had questions like, I'm intrigued by her dreams. They're mentioned passingly, but not in much detail. And then you're like asking about the mirroring of like the fathers and the different characters and stuff too. So, you have these questions, but again, all your questions are always directed around theme, I think, like thematic, not all of them, but these sort of deeper questions that can like pull meaning out of moments.
Well, actually, can I share a question? I remember asking Baxter about a different marathon story. Now,
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Now, I hope I'm not wrong.
I know exactly where you're going. And I already know where you're going before you get there, but go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, but just the guy who, this was during the recession, right? He lost his job, and after he was unemployed, and he worked somewhere on the west side of LA in financial services or something, I don't know. And he became a marathoner because he was out of work, right?
Yeah. And he was depressed. He had no sense of purpose. And so he took up running to try to find himself, basically.
Okay. And you wrote basically, I remember it ran A1. I remember it ran on the front page.
It was my first front page story. Yeah.
And I remember the editor oohing and awing over it, and various people. But do you remember, I did ask you one cool question.
You asked me about the marathon route and, where it actually like took him. And as fate would have it, the marathon route took him by his former place of employment where he had been laid off. And in fact, from the road, he was going to be able to look into, I think, his old office and maybe see his old desk. And Steve, and so that ended up becoming the kicker, was, at mile, whatever, he'll be able to see into the place where he worked for however many years and did this and that before he was fired, laid off, whatever, during the recession. And I think the final line was something to the effect of like, at that point he'll be X miles from the finish line.
Oh yeah.
Or something like that. But Steve did that. He just said, and so to Erika's point too, this was striking me. I've spoken to some college classes about, about this kind of stuff as we all have about like writing and whatnot. And often we get sometimes the question like, where do you find your ideas? And in truth, a lot of it comes from Steve, who teaches us how to find stories and whatnot. But as Erika was talking, I was realizing that when Steve talks to us about our stories, he has a tremendous sense of curiosity. These like little nuggets and things that he sees. He's very, very curious. He could just easily sit back and be like, okay, just go write it, whatever. But he's very curious. Like he invests himself in it. And I think through that, I don't want to speak for all of us, but I certainly think this is true for me, and I suspect it's true for a lot of Steve's mentors. It's like that curiosity that Steve has becomes a like part of our DNA. And so I find myself going out and being like, I almost doing these Steve Padilla isms of like, I wonder about this, or I wonder how long that's been there. I wonder if this person has ever done that, or I want, just like all these, questions that begin with I wonder or what about or something like that. And I'm like, oh, that's all from Steve. And so you have this very open-eyed view of the world, and it's like so driven by your ferocious curiosity, which we all feel when we sit down with you. And it guides us to, maybe want to know a little bit more about this little thing, that little thing, turn over this rock. Maybe there's an amazing detail there.
Well, that's very kind, guys. I will tell you that, when I ask questions, some of these questions, I frankly am envisioning, wouldn't it be cool if? So when I asked you if the guy was running anywhere near his office, I'm hoping, of course, that he really literally will run past his old office. I mean, the symbolism of that is just like, Hallmark Hall of Fame movie. And it was true,
Yeah.
And so sometimes you get lucky with that kind of thing,
Let's dive a little bit deeper into that about finding those moments of serendipity, finding those moments. Erika was talking about, looking at the earrings, and there's something about, looking at inanimate objects as like talisman or some sort of like a symbol. Steve, I don't think I actually have a question here, but can you talk a little bit about what exactly are you looking for? How do you discover those moments of symbolism or, inanimate objects that can speak for a greater truth about that person or the story?
Well, first of all, I think it pays to look for them. That I think without, distorting reality, that you can, we're talking nonfiction here, that you can be truthful to the reality of the story and find things that can, in essence, serve as symbols, So for example, Baxter, I forget if it was your idea, my idea, or a combo, but could you talk about the drums in the Stickball story?
Oh, yes. So I did this story about this kind of ancient Native American sport called stickball, very much like lacrosse.
But more violent, as you said.
Very, 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 very physical, very violent. They still play it in the traditional way. And I went to Philadelphia, Mississippi to report on the World Series of Stickball. Actually, if I can do a little bit of backstory. So the editor-in-chief read the marathon piece that had the kicker that Steve discovered about the guy running by his old office, asked to meet with me after that story. Right, yeah. And then he said, well, do you have anything else you want to write about? And I mentioned this story. And he said, that sounds great. Go do it. And so one thing led to another. Anyways, while I was there,
I think over the objections of sports, I don't think
it was during a lot of layoffs and cutbacks, and there wasn't money to do it. But then the top boss said, go do it. And then I was given the green light from there.
Okay. Anyway,
yeah. But when I was there reporting it, Steve was talking about like, what are you hearing? I was on the phone with Steve the whole time I was there. After almost every day of reporting, I was talking through Steve with everything. And Steve was asking me about like, what am I hearing? What does it feel like? What is it? The whole thing, like make it sensory and vivid, because you want to, put the reader there. And one of the things that I described was there is someone on the sideline who is beating a drum the entire game. And when we started to talk about symbolism, it was that the game itself is still here. It's still alive after all these years. It still, and in some ways, has a heartbeat. And Steve thought about the essence of that drum being very like powerful in that way. I think they're actually, one of the tribal elders may have said that too, that the drum actually represents the heartbeat of the game, still beating, which is why they played the whole game. And Steve was like, oh, that's perfect. Like so we, throughout the course of the story, I think the story opened with, you know, this kind of rhythmic drumming, and there's all these different scenes of things that are happening, but the drumming keeps kind of appearing, and then it's how the story ends, you know, like whatever the field clears, or a new game starts. I can't quite remember exactly, but like the drumming continues. And so
But
Steve
what's
was
cool
able
is,
to, yeah, go ahead.
I say, but it's not just at the very beginning and at the end. That's a pretty common, like newspaper technique,
Right.
and there's nothing wrong with it. It can often be effective, right? Just sandwich, construction. But this one, it periodically showed up. I mean, not overboard, but it was not just twice or even three times, I think.
Yeah, but Steve was able, again, this is through these conversations, you know, he was able to make me kind of see like what this represents. And then also in a way of using it inside of a story, and kind of the technique, I guess you could call it, or the vehicle of how that can move the story along, and how it was even truer to the essence of the story, and how we could use it in that way. So
Oh,
yeah,
can I
it
mention
was
one?
great.
I'm sorry,
Go
may I
ahead.
mention one other thing about that story? This is really fascinating. This is both the beauty and the perils of knowing a lot about a subject, because Baxter played this as a young man, right? As a boy and
Mm.
teenager and everything. So he knows this sport. And um, interestingly, the story didn't have a lot about the game that night that they played. And I kept asking for more details about the game. And at one point, you said something like, "It really wasn't a very good game. Either the score was too lopsided, or I don't know what it was."
Mhm.
But you were viewing it as someone who knows the game, and I remember we talked about this, but for the reader, we didn't know any of this stuff. It's all
Yeah.
fascinating, even what you think is routine and boring, and not that actually well done. Anyways, I just thought it was really interesting that you
No,
were
and
too
that
familiar with the subject at that point.
and that speaks to what you were saying to Erika earlier when she went along with for the ride along story, you know, or to the prison, that you were saying beforehand. It doesn't really matter, like how it, you know, if the reaction is, you know, breaks down in tears or this kind of. It's just like we're just kind of capturing what it is, and that's the most human and real thing there is. And I think sometimes we can go into a story with the expectation of like there has to be some amazing, compelling, dramatic, you know, conclusion of action, or like we have some idea, and then it just plays out. And in some ways, like that's the purest, most, you know, human, whatever sense it is. And so I that actually taught me a lesson too. I mean, and as Erica was mentioning, and I was like, oh, that's so true. Like, you know, what Steve teaches you about, you need to go into a story and be open to whatever it is that happens, and maybe something that you didn't expect at all will happen, and it will be a far better story than you ever imagined, than whatever outcome. It's like it's not the movie type thing that you thought, because whatever, but it ends up being something else that's actually way more real and moving, and whatever else you want to
One
say.
other
So
key element to this, actually, real fast, Kevin, is that because he was there in Mississippi, and only had so much access to people, we talked every night. And part of the reason was, we're not going to, yeah, I know their phones, but there are only going to be so many ways to get, more material, follow-up material. And so I think one thing that happens, particularly for, I'm guessing, newspapers and magazines, editor and reporter have the discussion, reporter gets launched, and they don't talk again until the story gets filed.
yeah,
And so, not that you have to do this all the time, but sometimes you really need to talk while the reporter's still out in the field, and that changes everything.
Yeah.
couldn't agree more.
So we would be also lucky to have an editor like Steve, but I want to ask, since Erika is our special guest here this week, right? What would you say, Steve, makes Erika a great writer to edit? What is it about working with her and some of the things that she might be receptive to that other writers might not be receptive to?
Oh gosh. Well, first of all, she's just a really talented wordsmith. I mean, let's see. One thing I know is that when I've edited Erika, there's not a lot of fat in the sentences. I mean, yeah, I can find a word here, find a word there, but if something's going to shrink, it's often, the whole sentence has to come out, because you can't take out the extra words. There are no extra words. So I think here's one. So anyway, I think in terms of just the word craft, it's really tight. One thing I think is very challenging is with Erika was because you're dazzled by everything, how to, as an editor, step back and really look at what needs to be done. And so she did a Kindle single called Drowned by Corn. Am I getting the title right?
Yeah, I
Erika?
have your notes on that too.
Okay. And about a horrible
All those.
accident. These, was it 2 young men or 3 men they're in a corn silo.
Yeah, one survived. Well,
One
one that I
survives.
saw. Yeah.
Yeah, and one essentially drowns in the corn, in the
Yeah.
kernel in the corn.
Terrible. Yeah.
Oh my God. And she describes this in great detail.
Mm-hmm.
And then you asked me to read it.
Oh, I have
And
all your notes. Yeah, I pulled them.
and I forget if it was you asking, you said there's something about the middle that slows down or something. And I forget if you asked me that or your editor wanted that. And my mission was to look at the middle because somehow it slowed a bit. And I was trying to figure out why.
Mm-hmm.
And
you, yeah, go ahead.
no, so maybe if you got my notes, what it
Yeah,
was,
you
because it all
you
read really great.
You said minor characters. I flesh out everything. I do. I flesh out everything. I get everything in there, and then it's so often too much reporting, like too much. I think a lot of us do that. But that was something you said. These minor characters, and that's something I often talk about with students too, like walk-on characters. That's your terminology, the walk-ons. Like they come on to serve a purpose, right? But they're not like, you don't need to know everything about them necessarily. They're there to sort of serve the purpose of the main narrative too. And so you had notes on the sections where these walk-on characters were kind of making it drag, I think. And
yeah. But it was all fascinating stuff. But then, so it took me a while to figure out what was going on. Then I realized I forget if they were witnesses or cops or whoever, but anyway, they were, supporting cast members. And there might be, like 3 graphs on them when you really needed just 2.
right.
But what was cool about them though, and what I liked was that she wasn't just, when she had the supporting cast member, it wasn't just name and age. There was like this little extra bit of detail that did bring them to life and that did help the story. So I think that's something that the typical journalist doesn't do. So she's bringing these supporting cast members to life, but how much do you need? So,
right.
but more, I think, so sometimes you want more than name than just the name, age, and city,
Yeah, I mean, that one was like really long. So that was part of why I went too long on also when you have all this space, you go sometimes too long. It doesn't need to actually be that long. And so with all the characters,
The other thing I remember from that story was a very rare thing with you was, I think I commented that, because there's a trial.
Yep,
and there's courtroom that her, believe it or not, her writing voice changed.
I can't believe you remember this.
It got into like legalese, which didn't sound
you
like Erika.
You said that. You said the court stuff slows down because unconsciously you start using legalistic language. And then you said, read this out loud. So yeah, it's amazing that you actually remember this many years later.
I can't remember like how to log on, but I can remember,
it's
but
true.
Yeah,
though.
and then you put it back in your voice, and then that also sped it up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was just thinking about when you were talking to Baxter about like endings, and I know you have that, you often tell people you don't have to end in a quote, right? And but there was this story about these 2 teenagers in love in Los Angeles, Lionel and Beatrice, and they were like an interracial couple in love in a school where there were a lot of, we had covered a lot of like race riots and between different groups and like tensions and a lot of stuff happening in that school. And so the whole story was like a love story in the backdrop of all this happening. So and then I remember the ending of that. I know we discussed it, was this moment of like, they're in this classroom, there's not enough books. And like the very last scene was like Lionel like sliding his book because there's not enough to her to use, and it was just like this small gesture, but it was like this little moment. But again, it was like, that's how the story ended. Like he slides the book towards.
It was kind of a Romeo and Juliet thing because one of them was Latino and one is Black. And it was a school that used to be mostly Black, but now is predominantly Latino. And there was all this tension there, and yet these kids who were maybe 14 and 15, 16, something like that, were boyfriend and girlfriend. They were adorable. Yeah.
So those, like I said, the moments of like and again, looking for those details that convey meaning, and thinking of ways to report those and like talk about those too, because they don't always pop out when you're in the field. They just don't. And so we are lucky to be able to call you up and like say, hey, what do you think, while we're in the middle of it? But I know
Well,
not
the other
everybody
thing,
has that
Kevin,
luxury.
one of the things about your comment about what it's like to edit her, the when that book came out, The Death Class, and I mean, this just sounds so corny, but there is this thing where you just go, where you hold up a book and you go, I know this person, I know her. Oh my God, so it's just immensely satisfying, and it got very good reviews, and I know you probably can't reveal any details, but you're working on another book right now.
Yeah,
Can't
it's
share
almost
anything.
done. And Steve and I had this long conversation in, what's the Astro or something?
Yeah, at the
Cafe
Astro
in
Diner,
Silver Lake.
my unofficial office in Silver Lake, California. Yeah.
Yes.
You know.
And that book, it's gone on it's taken me a while because of everything happening in the world in my life.
Well,
But
but an interesting thing with that, I think we can say, is you had like, vision A for it. And I
yes,
said, well, really, what about vision B? But then I think you discovered vision C is the real one, right?
exactly. But
Yeah.
I also had in my head that I had to, we can talk about it, it's not a big deal. Like there are these
Okay.
twins who were born in Vietnam and given up. One was given to a orphanage, right? And the other one ended up in this like mountain village raised by these two women who raised her, and they didn't really know of each other, and they're identical. And the one in the orphanage gets adopted and moves to the United States and is raised by a white family, in a very white town. And it's like, and yeah, so that's the beginning of it. Now, I always thought, well, we don't have to tell everybody that I don't need to tell everybody they got together. Like they eventually reunite. There's this whole thing, but I should like maybe withhold that, right? Because that seems like the natural kind of driving narrative. And I remember you talking about, we were like, that's the story of how, like, what's the journey, not necessarily the big reveal is that they reunite at some point, because we sort of heard that story too. Like,
Well, and also I agree that in terms of selling the book, the only reason people would buy it is if they knew there was this reunion of these two twins.
Mhm.
yeah, and I just couldn't wrap my head around
And
that. I was like,
that you'd
no,
have that the cat would have to be let out of the bag.
right, right. Yeah, I remember having that discussion. Like I was still stuck in this idea that it sort of had to be some. But anyway, right away now when I begin the book, right away what happens, and so it's actually, that's like the least interesting part. So the fact that they reunite is like actually the least interesting part of the journey. The journey is like absolutely like not what I expected.
And the two girls are now like in Illinois,
They're both in
like going to
Illinois.
college or something like that, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's
together.
just an insane story. But that goes to the issue of what is, and I think Baxter, you've done these multi-character things, what's the point of view? I mean, for this book, I mean, you've got the twins, you've got the adoptive mom, you've got the two essentially aunties who raised the girl who was left in Vietnam. I mean, geez, it's a true ensemble cast,
Yeah.
Right.
So if there's anything we learned about today, it's that first off, Erika has done more research and homework for this show than the two of us combined.
Then certainly I have, I'll tell you.
Yeah, right. So first of all, thank you, Erika, for that. But before we go, I know there's probably a sort of long list, and I think the solution is we're just gonna have you back on again soon, Erika. But is there one other lesson in your notes that you've taken that really resonated with you and that you have used to pass on to your students now?
Yeah, I mean, I there's so many. I mean, I mentioned like the walk-on characters, the theme, talking about stories. I just think, like I said at the beginning of the talk, like all of these lessons have become ingrained in my psyche, like since, and again, even with starting with these like weekender stories sometimes, and making those into narratives, and then taking these tips that you have, which you can use them for small stories, and you can like use them in these 85,000 word, like all of those tips are still like woven into long form and book, so they're all applicable across length, and as in nonfiction. And so like I hear like I'll hear your voice sort of like, kind of how you would think about a scene, right? Or, and how you would think about a story, honestly. And so one lesson that I've brought into, writing today is about finding story ideas, I think. And like I always think that when I look at story ideas now, I used to think sort of like, here's just the story, it's interesting to me, and then I just need to write it. But now when I think about my discussions with you two, all these discussions we've had over the years, I think like stories have to sort of have multi-dimensional elements. Like you have an interesting character, but there's also some other dimension that makes like this character represent something bigger than themselves that kind of resonates with readers. And so that's where the theme comes in, the reporting, and like thinking about like that moment when he pushes the book, or these little moments you all are talking about. So I think of like what you've left me with is this idea of thinking about stories in their many dimensions, and how to like make it not just like one storyline that is sort of flat. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, and I would say, frankly, if people look at the work of all three of you, it's layered. That's the word I like to use. I mean, yeah, you might have the story about that's, technically about A, but it's really got other layers and ripples to it, some deeper meaning, whether it's the Stickball story or Baxter, when you wrote, we still got to do a session talking about your piece about the basketball town USA, that operates on many different levels. Kevin, of course, we've mentioned the piece about the chef, and that is a story of obsession, of family, of one man, not to mention of food and teachers. I mean, and I know the thing is, you can overdo this kind of thing. I mean, what's the old saying, the Freud saying, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, right? But I think if you do the kind of thorough reporting, that we can legitimately say, hey, there is some other meaning here. I know that sounds so grandiose, but it's true, right? I mean, that you can I think legitimately share with the readers, but you have to look for it, and you have to definitely have the reporting to back it up, which is what all three of you do.
Well, Erika Hayasaki, thank you so much for joining us, and we're so glad we're able to reunite you over Zoom with Steve. Baxter, again, thanks so much as always, and Steve, you are a hero. What can we say? Thanks so much. And for all of you watching here, thank you for watching this. Please hit like, just do whatever you do on the YouTube thing. And if you have any ideas for future talks, please let Steve know. He's at Steve Padilla 2 on Twitter. And we've got all those links here in the comment section below. But for Baxter and Erika and Steve, I'm Kevin Pang. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time on the Steve Padilla Sessions.